Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Telescope Podcast. Thank you for listening.
What's up, everybody? Everyone in this place, if you could do a handstand, I want to see your feet up in the air right now. Wave them around, that's right. Woo! We're the hype.
Hello. Welcome to the Telescope Podcast. This is episode number 15 of the podcast. We look at culture through the spyglass of faith here on the Telescope. My name is Matthew Seipel Anderson. It's great to be here. I'm hanging out in my dining room. It's late, it's 11:30, but I'm so pumped to get this episode out that I'm willing to go the extra mile and stay up late to do it. Today's conversation is with Dr. Ralph Seelke. By the way, Ralph is not here in my dining room at 11:30 at night. This conversation is pre-recorded. Anyway, Dr. Seelke is a retired professor of microbiology at UWS. Dr. Seelke and I discuss God, science, faith, evolution, and intelligent design. It was a conversation that I greatly enjoyed. Dr. Seelke is very knowledgeable. Like I said, he had a career as a microbiologist, so he has a lot of really interesting things to say on the topic. And I should just add, as a personal note, intelligent design, which Dr. Seelke is a big advocate of, and we spend a lot of our time talking about. Intelligent design was very influential for me in college. I was introduced to intelligent design by my philosophy professor, Dr. Huddleston, who was no Christian. He was a firm skeptic, but he was a very fair skeptic and knew that I was a Christian, and so he turned me on to this kind of intellectual movement, and it really rocked my world, changed my life. And the cool thing is, it turns out that my philosophy professor was being influenced by his friend and colleague, Dr. Seelke. So, I may have Dr. Seelke to thank for saving my faith, or at least really strengthening my faith through my college years. I really appreciate it. In fact, Dr. Seelke and Dr. Huddleston worked together to bring in Philip Johnson to be a speaker at UWS, and he's the author of Darwin on Trial, which is one of the first books to really popularize the idea of intelligent design. And I was able to attend that lecture, and it was awesome. So here is my conversation with Dr. Seelke. All right, well, I'm sitting here at McDonald's with Dr. Ralph Seelke, and we're going to talk about intelligent design and evolution and the controversy around it. So, Dr. Seelke, thanks for meeting with me.
It's my pleasure.
So I guess as we get rolling, just tell us about your background as a scientist and why you became interested in science and faith and this whole subject.
Okay, well, I often tell people I became what I wanted to be when I was 8 years old.
Really?
Except it turned out better than I thought. I was kind of a nerdy kid, you know, the type that ruined the curve on the science courses. You could, keep me happy by giving me, science books for birthday and Christmas and that sort of stuff. So, so I liked science, wanted to be one, even though I didn't grow up knowing too many. But in growing up, there was never a science faith controversy. And went to college. First heard a clear presentation of the gospel of Christ in college, and both from what I heard and what I saw in the people that were talking to me about Christ. It was actually through the ministry of the Navigators, a long time ago. I became a believer in Christ, and I grew up probably in an era, in a place, in a discipline where that wasn't a problem. I was a microbiologist, and microbiology for many years for them, evolution was really irrelevant. Microbiologists were much more involved with, trying to cure diseases and discover the causes, and doing things that were fundamentally good than worrying about evolution. And some of that's because, what is an advanced bacteria? So some of these questions, how do we climb up the evolutionary ladder? Just doesn't apply to bacteria.
Sure.
They're just not going to, they're just not going to ask those questions. But it became very clear as I went into academia and got jobs, this was a problem with some, my upbringing in science and Christianity never allowed me the option of sort of splitting those two off. So life and faith were always supposed to be one. And so it became very clear in terms of how can I glorify God through my job, that asking questions about science and evolution were something that could happen. And in the mid-90s, Philip Johnson came out with Darwin on Trial, and Michael Behe came out with Darwin's Black Box. And other people saw this as a very persuasive arguments against evolution and for intelligent design. I saw it as a research program. Also ran into the work of a guy named Richard Lenski, who has been evolving bacteria ever since Darwin's birthday in 1989, and has gotten over 60,000 generations of bacteria, bacterial evolution. And his work kind of inspired me. He's certainly not a skeptic of evolution. But his system was something that I said, this system, I could ask interesting questions about evolution using this system. He basically had a system where in a year you could get 2,400 generations. And so I said, you can ask real questions and get real answers about what can evolution really do.
Interesting.
And so I said this would be very useful. So that's why I said it turned out better than I thought. I could teach. I could annoy my colleagues. I could have students question evolution, and I could actually ask questions that were both scientifically and theologically interesting. So I used to say, what I do is I ask, what can evolution really do? And if you think about that, that's a big question scientifically, and it's a big question theologically. Mm-hmm. So it was great.
Wow. So I want to unpack that a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so the work of Lenski basically became a model that you used to explore what evolution could really do. Mm-hmm. And that was becoming a more interesting question as the philosophical implications of evolution started to come out more in public, I guess you'd say. There were some different things happening out there, like philosophical people and debates over what should be in school textbooks.
Sure.
So you grabbed a hold of Lenski's work. Maybe explain, just break down how your research tested evolution.
Yeah. So what I did was one of the predictions of what's called irreducible complexity. One of the predictions is that evolution should have a very hard time doing multiple things at once, and that's simply because of probability. If something has a 1 in 100 million chance of happening, even though that's a small probability, okay, there's 300 million of us in the United States, it's going to happen 3 times. And so and you can fit 100 million bacteria in a tenth of a teaspoonful.
Wow.
So if something has a chance of 1 in 100 million, in terms of bacteria, it'll happen all the time. It's a slam dunk. When two things have to happen at that probability, now you're at 1 in 10,000 trillion. Just because of the nature of probabilities, you have to multiply. When two things both have to happen, you multiply the probabilities. And so yeah, it became, and so that now you're talking real numbers,
Right.
and so in theory those things should be hard to do.
Sure.
There were a lot of people saying, well, there's other paths things that can happen, and I said, well, I can test that.
Okay.
So I deliberately, very interesting. Nobody had actually wanted to test this. You would find things in the literature where it's sort of accidentally been tested. So I deliberately set out to make a bacteria, and that's one of the fun things about bacteria. You can do this, and I deliberately put in a gene, 2 mistakes. So out of 6,000 DNA bases that are needed for a bacteria to make the amino acid tryptophan. I'm getting into the weeds here.
Yeah, that's all right.
So there were 2 mistakes, and so that shut down that bacteria's ability to make tryptophan. Now we don't make it either. We get it because we eat food that has it. So I can keep these bacteria alive just by giving them a little bit of tryptophan. But if they make their own, this is like an enormous advantage. So yeah, if you're imagining yourself in a world where there's a scarce resource, and now you have the ability to make that scarce resource, you're gonna be good.
Yeah, you're gonna be king of the hill.
You're gonna be king of the hill. Which in bacterium terms mean everybody else stops making copies of themselves, and you keep going. That's essentially, that's all they do. They don't think, they don't write books, they don't go to meetings, but they do make more of themselves. And they're much, on a good day they can make a new copy of themselves in 20 minutes. Wow. So that was the sort of thing that I tested. I actually did 3 long-term, multi-thousand generation experiments, and now, lest you think I'm a dull guy, it was actually more interesting than that. But the bottom line was the number 2 is an evolution stopper.
Okay.
And all the work that I did actually verified that. That if you give 2 things have to happen for an evolutionary event to take place, it pretty much shuts it down.
Okay. And so how this applies to more evolution on a macro level, if I'm understanding right, is the theory is that animals have all these millions of years, and that given enough time, they can evolve into radically different forms. And so by zooming in to the bacterial world, you can bring the bacteria through thousands of generations where it might take an animal millions of years. You can do thousands of generations in a relatively short time, and you can test to see, can this simple organism, and according to Darwin, the simpler the organism, the easier time it should have evolving.
Should be easier.
And so what you're saying is, once you gave 2 things that it had to overcome, that shut down evolution.
Pretty much, yeah. It's an evolutionary stop, and that's actually a relevant fact today. We have turned AIDS from a death sentence to a manageable disease by understanding that.
Okay.
The fact that people can have AIDS and continue to live has to do with the fact that we asked the virus to overcome not 1, not 2, but 3 poisons at the same time. And now the virus is actually its mutation rate is about 10,000 times faster than that of a bacteria. But let's see, actually, yeah, about 10,000 times faster than that of a bacteria. I had to check my exponents there. But when you ask it to simultaneously become resistant to 3 different poisons, none of which are alike, so they're killing the bacteria, the virus in 3 different ways, it becomes a showstopper.
Okay.
And I personally, one of the great tragedies of the late 20th century was the fact that we didn't understand that in 1950. We kept doing stupid things like we'd get an antibiotic and give it to the bacteria and they would become resistant, and then we'd find another one and they'd become resistant. And
just made them stronger?
Well, eventually, if you do things one at a time as opposed to asking things to do it, all at the same time, evolution can defeat that. But yeah, so that's why now you have bacteria that are essentially to cure you. There's a race between finding an antibiotic and the bacteria's progress towards killing you.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a relevant sort of thing.
Okay. So there's 2 terms you've mentioned that I think would be helpful for the audience.
Yeah.
Which is massive, by the way.
Yes.
One is you mentioned the term irreducible complexity.
Right.
And that's a term I believe Michael Behe coined.
Right.
In Darwin's Black Box.
Right. Yeah. So we're all familiar with it. We may not have the name. Behe made the mousetrap famous. It's simply the idea that if you're going to have something happen, you often need multiple parts, and if you take away one part, you get no function. So if you visualize a typical mousetrap, if you take away any part, you don't have less of a mousetrap. You have no mousetrap at all.
Sure.
And biological systems, especially at the cellular level, Behe was essentially a molecular biologist. They're just chock full of those things. So you got all sorts of things where breaking any one part, it's not like you have part of it working. The whole thing is broken.
Okay.
And so, from an evolutionary standpoint, so how do you get something when you need multiple things all that have to work in order to get anything to function? So, and that's why the probability thing. There's many things that have the bacteria flagella is a classic. There's 40 things you can break.
Sure. And
you don't get a bacteria able to move itself from one place to another. And so, so those things. So how do you evolve this thing when there's all these parts that are there? And again, the probabilities. So if you need multiple things all at once to happen, the probabilities of all those things happening become the numbers just aren't in your favor.
Yeah. And so, and Darwin expected that the more we zoomed in to the microscopic level, the simpler we'd find things, and that would explain how they could evolve step by step.
I think he was. If you look at what people thought about cells in the 1860s, it's kind of funny now. But they thought things were very simple, and so the idea was you went from simple to complex, and it turns out that simple is just very, very complex.
Yeah. So the more we've zoomed in, the more we see these micro machines and.
Yeah. So you get. You have entire books, you have entire disciplines devoted to bacterial physiology. So there's just no simple systems, essentially. And so what evolution has to do to produce those becomes very, very large.
Okay. And then another thing that I want to ask you about is, maybe I should put it this way. I think for some people, evolution is kind of a take it or leave it idea. Mm-hmm. And is that the case for people of faith, or is there a place to say evolution is a thing that we can observe, but we can't give it all the credit that
Right. Yeah.
has been given to it?
Yeah. This becomes something of a language problem. Yeah, evolution is used in a couple of different ways, and often people will deliberately confuse those. So
Bait and switch.
yeah, it's a bait and switch. So evolution, we can talk about. Yeah, we talk about bacteria evolving the ability to resist antibiotics. We talk about plants evolving the ability to resist herbicides. And those are all legitimate uses of those, and people see that every day. I mean, so we're not asking people to deny reality. The second use of those is this grand story that random purposeless processes can produce all the complexity and diversity that is found in life, and that's of course the story that in essence it becomes a God substitute.
Sure.
And that's of course when it becomes a problem. In essence, what Paul said in Romans, that what we see around us is supposed to tell us that God exists and He's very powerful, becomes short-circuited. Instead, what we're supposed to see is that this process of this random process can produce all this beauty and complexity and diversity. And so instead of looking at the world and saying, well, there must be a God and He must be powerful. I don't know if He loves me. I can't answer that question, but He's there. He's pretty smart. He's pretty powerful, and maybe I should pay attention. We say, we say this is a world that's been created by random processes that did not have us in mind, as one of the I think Ernst Mayr once put it. So yeah, and that's where of course it becomes a problem. There's various Christians have solved this in a variety of ways. The three most popular are young Earth and old Earth and what I call theistic evolution approaches to that. Theistic evolutionists, I think, would give more credence to evolution's powers than I would. But would say, behind all this, you still have God Himself directing that task. So that's why it came up with, people and who can think about Him and love Him,
Sure.
and not attributing that to blind forces. So yeah, that's how Christians have typically dealt. Those are three very broad ways.
Okay. So then, what would you say, if there's someone listening who is struggling to embrace faith because, the evolutionary naturalistic worldview, it does provide a story that, it's like a basis for a whole worldview.
Right,
you can
right.
base,
Right.
And so that can be a barrier for people if that's how they view the whole world through that lens. Letting go of that somewhat can be difficult. Any advice you can give, or maybe some?
Yeah, I would say learn more science, not less.
Okay.
I think.
I love that answer.
Yeah, I think when I simply from what I know when I go through life, I still keep kind of amazed. I mean, we live in a land where the world wakes up every spring, and so there's all this stuff that has to happen, and it's very complicated. And so when spring comes, if you have some understanding of how complicated it is for plants to wake up and do it right and not get frozen out. My apple trees, they go through this calculation every year. And they decide at the end of the year whether life has been good enough for them to make apples next year. Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. And it's like, if an engineer had to do that, that would be, the circuitry that you'd have to produce would be complicated. So if you understand photosynthesis, it's this kind of amazing process. You understand how muscles move, or nerves fire. So you're left with this incredible impression of design, and you can end up with this sort of mocking. Well, let's see random processes make this thing, and so I think knowing more science is a very good answer. I know lots of believers are young Earth creationists. I think for them, do not make it appear that if the Earth is old, that somehow you've lost. Okay, I think there's a lot of people who it's like if I allow God billions of years, natural processes could do their work and come up with us. That's simply not true. So I would learn more science and not less science, and then read books. There's lots of good books out there, and the other thing is you're constantly being bombarded by these sort of confident statements that you hear in the news, and I think you want to develop kind of an irreverent mocking of that sort of certainty that comes out. As if you really, when people say things like, birds evolved from dinosaurs, it's like, as if you can actually show that to have happened. So then, kind of a certain amount of irreverence to all these smart guys who would make those claims.
Yeah, because journalists love flashy headlines like "missing link found."
Well,
give it a month and then a new paper will come out. Oh, just kidding.
So certain irreverence towards some of these maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I guess irreverence is a good enough word. Kind of a skepticism about some of those things. Fundamentally, it's can what we've seen actually do any of that? And the answer is somewhere between no and you've got to be kidding. So,
right.
Learn more science. Kind of keep a kind of a mocking attitude about some of these.
I've personally been amazed by how confident of a front, the naturalistic gatekeepers, I guess you could say. How confident, the people who produce shows for, PBS and things like that are so confident, but then if you just get a little bit below the surface and you discover they really have no idea how life began, how, like you mentioned, in every single cell there's complicated systems and physiology, and they have no idea how that could have evolved randomly, let alone how higher order animals could have come to being.
I used to say, the confidence, they kind of have the confidence as if Carl Sagan was there with time-lapse video, watching the whole thing. And, it's just not true. Just a certain, and that's been noted, that if you go into certain areas of academia, there's a lot of seeing that the standard story is inadequate. There was just a big meeting in November at Cambridge, that highlighted the inadequacy of the standard story. But typically you never hear that. you know, it's like we have to produce this confident, unified front without any dissension in there. So, and yeah, just realize that it's spin. So.
All right, well, that seems like a pretty good place to wrap up. Do you have any other thoughts you wanted to share before we sign off?
No, in terms of stuff to read, Discovery Institute has taken the lead. I don't get any money from them to say that. I do. I have been associated with them for several ventures that they've done. But yeah, read books. There's plenty there that can keep you a skeptic. And just recognizing that that this media story is just a story, and don't buy into it.
All right, well, very good. Well, thanks so much for doing this interview, and that's it. We're signing off. All right, thank you again, Dr. Ralph Seelke, for taking the time to hang out with me and talk about intelligent design and faith, and to give us some good advice and some good information. Again, if you're interested in learning more about intelligent design, the Discovery Institute out of Seattle, Washington is probably the premier intelligent design organization. They have a lot of professors that are a part of their organization, a part of their network. In fact, after the interview, Dr. Seelke told me that he's connected with the Discovery Institute, and he even got to go to Texas to testify in some of the again, it's 11:30 at night. I'm sitting at my dining room table. I don't remember all the details of this conversation. I believe he was testifying in front of the Board of Education as they were making some decisions about school curriculum and what can be, what's allowed. And how that works is there's wording in these standards, and the standards are what the teachers have to use when they're preparing their curriculum for the year. Their curriculum has to meet up all these standards, and so the wording in the standards is really important because it can open or close doors to what can be taught. Anyway, I think that's what Dr. Ralph was involved in, but I can't remember. But anyway, suffice it to say, it's super cool that he's connected with the Discovery Institute. I love their podcast. They have a great podcast, and dozens and dozens of super good books. Icons of Evolution, Darwin's Black Box, The Edge of Evolution. There's just so many good ones. Stephen Myers has a super good one about the fossil record, about the Cambrian explosion, how every major animal group came into being during this relatively small time in geologic history, the Cambrian explosion. The End of Christianity is a super good one. So there's just so many good resources out there and so much good information that you should really check it out. So anyway, thanks again for listening. My name is Matthew Seipel Anderson. This is the Telescope Podcast. I'm on Twitter at MSA_music. I'm on Facebook, the Telescope Podcast, and my website is mysaviorsanthem.com. So until next time, thanks a lot. I'd love it if you went onto iTunes and left us a rating, because that actually helps the podcast show up in searches. So with no ratings, no people commenting on iTunes, I will be lost in obscurity. So that would be sweet. Also be great to have a conversation on Twitter or Facebook. Facebook would be best because I have the Telescope Podcast Facebook page. So go there, leave a comment, and that would be awesome. So thanks again. Take care.
What's up, everybody? Everyone in this place, if you can do a handstand, I want to see your feet up in the air right now.